Star Wars 7x7 episode 2081. Well, the circle is now complete, or rather, the arc is now complete. Since we've finished the 4th episode of the Clone Wars from Season 7, that means the first story arc is complete, and today we're going to take one last look and review the arc before we move on to arc number 2. Punch it! Hey Rebel Rouser, I'm Alan Voivod and this is Star Wars 7x7. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode. So it's complete, the first story arc of Clone Wars Season 7. And I do have to say I'm surprised it's this one. So at the time that we found out that the Clone Wars was going to have a Season 7, there were a lot of discussions about what story arcs would be included, and we knew at the time that there were 13 different story arcs that had been in various stages of development prior to the cancellation of the Clone Wars and the finishing of it with the Lost Missions and so on and so forth. We knew that 2 of those story arcs out of the 13 had been adapted into the Dark Disciple novel by Christie Golden. We knew that Darth Maul, Son of Dathomir was something related to one of those story arcs also. And, the Bad Batch story reels were out, which was another one. So there were all these story arcs that were floating around in the ether that we didn't know anything about or that we hadn't seen any significant details about, that we all thought, well, we're going to be part of what these final story arcs were. I say we all thought, maybe not everybody thought that. That's probably not a fair statement. But I think it was kind of the logical thing, right? That, why would they tell us a story that we already knew something about? And yet we had the Bad Batch for our first story arc. And we know we're going to have the Siege of Mandalore for the final story arc, which was described to some degree, or at least elements thereof were described to some degree by Dave Filoni at the Ahsoka's Untold Tales panel at Celebration London back in 2016, which makes me think that at that time, they had no idea that they were going to get a green light to produce any of this stuff. I wonder when they finally knew. Obviously, the announcement at Comic-Con in, 2018? 2019? Gosh. Time flies. Oh man. When did they actually know? Because it had to have been well before that announcement. But they would have also had to make the decisions for what story arcs they were going to produce for this final season and how long it was going to be and all that. And I guess choosing the Bad Batch in a way was kind of an easy decision because they had a lot of the groundwork done for it already. They weren't necessarily having to start from scratch. And as we've discussed over the past 4 Clone Wars briefings, there was, a lot changed here and there, right? And nothing necessarily essentially major, but there were definitely differences between the story reel versions of the episodes and the final versions of the episodes. I would say probably the most significant change would have to be the epilogue of this last episode, Unfinished Business, which was, as we discussed in the briefing yesterday, a medal ceremony. And in the final version, they just referred to the medal ceremony and had a very emotional final moment with Echo and Rex and the Bad Batch. Honestly, I think the change I was most surprised about was the fact that they changed the fortune cookies or the morals for all 4 of the episodes. That was probably more startling than anything else, to me at least. It kind of makes sense that, as you look back at the episodes, which were done, 4, 5, 6 years ago, or at least, at the level at which they had been done, why wouldn't you, look at those and go back and say, all right, let's tweak this. Let's do something different with that. Let's, drop this, but add this. That seems perfectly natural. For some reason, the morals, that was like, what? They changed that? I don't know. That was the thing that I thought was the most shocking personally. But overall, the story arc was very well done. I do think that the third element of it, On the Wings of Kiridax, was probably the weakest of them all. And really, it was, weakest only by like a few percentage points. And that's because it would have only taken, 1 or 2 extra elements to bring it up to the level of the other 3. I feel like it was just, okay, great. We have to see them escape. It's an action-packed episode. There's a lot to recommend it, but there's not a lot to make it essential for all intents and purposes. Nothing that makes it part of, the knowledge that you need to have. And so, as we discussed in that Clone Wars briefing, there are elements that they could have added for it. But the pacing of it, the action, the humor, and the overall scope of it was very well done indeed. And something that is going, I'd say, comparatively unnoticed. A lot of this is about the Bad Batch and Rex and Echo, all of that relationship stuff. But additionally, the journey of Anakin to the dark side and the little steps that keep being laid out for him to walk that path, and seeing how he progresses from where we left him at the end of Attack of the Clones to where he arrives at the beginning of Revenge of the Sith, this definitely builds a bridge toward that final situation where we see him with Dooku at his mercy and deciding to just outright kill him. Yeah, probably with a bit of a nudge from Palpatine, to be sure, but you can see that the Anakin Skywalker we're dealing with in Unfinished Business in the last episode, the way he confronts Admiral Trench and cuts off 3 of his arms. Yeah, that's an Anakin who is not too far away from beheading Count Dooku at the beginning of Revenge of the Sith. And speaking of the Bad Batch themselves, well, that leads me to, one other thing I want to share with you about this particular story arc, which I will do right after the break. Stay tuned. Hey Rebel Rouser, I've made some changes to the asteroid belt level at patreon.com/SW7X7, and they are all with sponsors in mind. So if you want to get the word out about your business, your product, your service to a dedicated Star Wars audience, then please check out patreon.com/SW7X7 and look for the asteroid belt level for details. Again, that's patreon.com/SW7X7. Welcome back. So, the bummer about this Bad Batch story overall is that the Bad Batch is really cool. And we're only getting them for one story arc. I mean, maybe they'll show up in either of the 2 story arcs that remain. That would be really awesome. But for this group of very compelling characters to show up in Season 7, when we know this is the final season of the Clone Wars, oh man, this is a bit of a bummer because we know we're not going to see very much of them at all. And it turns out that there was another story arc that was planned for the Bad Batch. They were supposed to confront a Trandoshan separatist leader by the name of Babwa Venomore, and there was going to be something happening on Kashyyyk that involved this Trandoshan. And that was something revealed at one of the various Clone Wars panels that they've had at Celebrations past. So we know there are more stories out there about the Bad Batch, and just because this is the final season of Clone Wars, man, I hope that they find a way to continue their stories because it's pretty darn compelling, I think. And it's another example of how you can explore all sorts of different genres with Star Wars storytelling. And, that sort of special forces spy kind of movie, I think would be fantastic. Movie, TV show, special books, comics, whatever you want to do with it. So there you go. That's our wrap for story arc number 1 from Season 7 of the Clone Wars, and that's going to do it for this episode of the show. Thank you so much for joining me for it, as always, and may the Force be with you wherever in the galaxy you may be.
Star Wars 7x7 is not endorsed or sponsored yet by Lucasfilm Limited, Disney, or 20th Century Fox, and is intended for entertainment and information purposes only. Star Wars, the Star Wars logo, all names and pictures of Star Wars characters, vehicles, and any other Star Wars-related items are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of Lucasfilm Limited or their respective trademark and copyright holders. May the Force be with them. All original content is copyright 2020 by Star Wars 7x7. We hope you love it.